A little girl had apologized for daring to ask a stranger for help at the station. That small, fragile apology would change both their lives forever. "I just wanted to ask, that's all. I'm sorry." The words came out so softly they nearly vanished into the noise of Union Station before anyone had time to truly hear them. The public address announcements echoed from the soaring ceiling. Suitcases rolled and clattered over the patterned stone floor. Hurried footsteps streamed past in every direction. And yet the 6-year-old girl standing near the platform felt completely invisible. She clenched the straps of the pink backpack on her shoulders, as if bracing for a blow that had been coming for a long time. Rosie Bennett stood before a man who clearly didn't belong to this place the way she did. His long black coat was perfectly tailored, his leather shoes shone even though snow was falling outside, and the phone in his hand looked more expensive than anything her mother had ever owned. His black hair was slicked neatly back. A faint scar ran along the left side of his chin, and his gray-blue eyes were sharp as steel. Eyes accustomed to looking through people, more than looking at them. His name was Alexander Stone, though Rosie didn't know that. She also didn't know he was the most powerful man in Chicago. To her, he was simply someone who looked important enough to know which hospital was closest. Her mother had been taken away by ambulance a few hours earlier. She had collapsed right there in the middle of the station, one hand pressed to her chest, her face bloodless and pale. Her mother had said, "Rosie, wait here. Ask someone to help if you need it. I'll be back." But her mother didn't come back, and Rosie waited. She waited until morning turned into night. She waited until her stomach twisted with hunger. But she didn't dare leave. She waited. And finally she gathered every shred of courage she had to ask for help. She had practiced what she meant to say in her head for 20 minutes, repeating it again and again in silence, her heart pounding so loudly she was afraid it would betray her. But when she finally spoke in front of that tall, frightening man, everything she'd prepared came out wrong, smaller than she'd intended, filled with apologies instead of hope. Alexander looked down at her, a flicker of irritation crossing his face before he could stop it. He was late for an important meeting, his mind submerged in numbers and schemes, and the last thing he expected was to be bothered by a child. "I'm not the information desk, kid," he said curtly, his voice clipped and cold as ice. Rosie flinched as if she'd known the answer was coming all along. Her green eyes, the same eyes as her mother's, dropped to the floor and she nodded quickly, her brown curls falling forward to hide her small face. "I'm sorry," she whispered again, softer than before, the words almost impossible to hear. "I didn't mean to bother you." She took a step back, then turned away before he could say anything else. Her old canvas shoes moved slowly across the vast station floor, each step heavy despite her tiny body. The thin knit dress she wore looked rumpled and far too light for a December night in Chicago. The pink backpack, with an old teddy bear inside, the last gift her mother had given her when she was still well, dragged at her shoulders, making her tilt forward as she walked, as if she were already tired from carrying things heavier than a 6-year-old should ever have to carry. Alexander watched her leave without meaning to. Something in the way she apologized stayed lodged in his mind, echoing with an uncomfortable persistence. In his world, children from powerful families usually demanded, shouted, or cried when they were refused. This child apologized for having existed in his space. He glanced at the Patek Philippe on his wrist, then back at his phone, trying to push the feeling away. Roman was waiting in the car. The meeting couldn't be delayed any longer, but when he looked up again, his eyes found the small figure disappearing into the crowd, and a strange unease settled in his chest, in the place he'd believed had turned to stone long ago. She wasn't walking toward anyone. No adult was waiting for her. She didn't look back, as if she already knew no one would follow. Around them, Union Station kept moving, vivid and indifferent. Trains arrived and departed. People laughed, argued, held each other, then hurried away to the warmth of their families. And in the middle of all that, a 6-year-old girl with a pink backpack walked alone, her mother lying somewhere in a hospital, not knowing whether her daughter was safe. Rosie Bennett had learned, one more time, that asking for help always came with an apology. But she didn't know the cold man would turn back. And when he did, both their lives would never be the same again. If you want to know what made the coldest mafia boss in Chicago turn around, tap like to support this video. Share this story with anyone who needs to be reminded that asking for help is nothing to be ashamed of. And don't forget to subscribe to follow the tear-filled journey ahead. Alexander stepped out of the station with legs that felt as heavy as lead. A glossy black Maybach was already waiting at the curb, Roman standing by the door, giving a small nod of greeting when he saw his boss approach. The December wind cut hard, carrying tiny flakes of snow that slapped against Alexander's face. But he didn't feel cold. He felt something else instead. Something more uncomfortable than Chicago's skin-splitting chill. "Boss," Roman said as he opened the door, his voice low and steady as always. Alexander stopped at the open door. His hand rested on the frame, and all it would take was one more step to sink into warm leather, to be driven to the meeting, to slide back into his life as if nothing had happened. But his feet wouldn't move. "I'm sorry." That small voice rang in his head, frighteningly clear. Not a shouted demand, not sobbing and pleading, just an apology, light as breath, fragile as a thread, and yet it had lodged in his mind like a needle he couldn't pull out. Alexander closed his eyes. He'd turned away hundreds of people in his life. He'd stared down the most powerful enemies and never once shaken. He'd built an empire on coldness and ruthlessness. So why couldn't he step into the car because of a 6-year-old child? "Boss, is something wrong?" Roman asked, a trace of concern slipping into his tone. Alexander opened his eyes and stared into the empty space ahead. He remembered the girl's green eyes that held no resentment when she was refused, only dropping in quiet acceptance. He remembered the way she nodded, as if she was used to the world turning its back. He remembered the thin knit dress, the old canvas shoes, and the pink backpack dragging her shoulders down. A 6-year-old child had been standing alone in a crowded station on a freezing December night, and he'd walked away. "Wait here," Alexander said, his voice short but final. He turned and went back into the station before Roman could ask anything else. His stride was faster than it had been when he left. His heart hammered harder than it should have, and he didn't understand why. He'd faced gunfire without trembling. So why did he feel anxious now? Just because of a strange child. Union Station was as crowded as before. People streamed past. The loudspeaker announcements kept calling out. Suitcases kept rolling over the floor. Alexander threaded through the crowd, his gray-blue eyes sweeping everywhere, searching for a small figure with a pink backpack. Then he saw her. Rosie was sitting on a long metal bench near a corner of the station where the light was slightly dimmer than elsewhere. She sat curled in on herself, her feet not reaching the ground, swinging gently in the air. The pink backpack was clutched tight in her arms, as if it were the only thing she had left in the world. She wasn't crying. She wasn't calling for anyone. She just sat there, small and alone, inside a world rushing past without anyone stopping. Alexander stood a few feet away and watched. He noticed details he'd missed before. Her lips were faintly purple from the cold. Her small hands gripped the backpack straps so tightly her knuckles had gone white. Her eyes stared straight ahead, focused on nothing, as if she were trying not to let fear swallow her whole. She wasn't looking for anyone. She wasn't getting up to run around. She was just sitting there and waiting, as if she believed that if she stayed still long enough, her mother would come back. A 6-year-old shouldn't have eyes like that, Alexander thought. A 6-year-old should cry, should scream, should demand attention. But this child sat in silence, waiting, as if she'd learned that tears didn't help, that screaming only made everything worse. Alexander drew a slow, deep breath. He didn't know what he was doing. He didn't know why he was here. He only knew he couldn't walk away again. He stepped closer and stopped in front of the bench. Rosie looked up, and when she recognized him, her green eyes widened in surprise. Not fear, not hope, just pure surprise, as if she couldn't believe anyone would actually come back. You came back?" she asked, her voice so small Alexander had to bend down to hear it. And in that moment, looking into the clear, unguarded eyes of that little girl, Alexander knew his life was about to change in a way he never could have imagined. Alexander sat down on the bench across from her, keeping just enough distance so he wouldn't scare the little girl. He wasn't used to this. He wasn't used to sitting at eye level with anyone, wasn't used to lowering his voice and speaking gently. But there was something in those green eyes that kept him from behaving the way he normally did. "You haven't told me what you need," he said, his voice still low, but with less of the sharp chill it had carried earlier. "Back there, what were you trying to ask me?" Rosie studied him for a moment, as if weighing whether she should trust this man at all. Then she looked down, her voice so small it sounded like she was afraid of being a bother. "I wanted to ask which hospital is closest." Alexander frowned. "A hospital. Are you hurt?" Rosie shook her head, her brown curls swaying. "Not me. My mom. Where is your mother?" That simple question made the little girl's lips tremble. She hugged the pink backpack tighter, as if she could draw strength from it. "I don't know. The ambulance took her. She told me to wait here. She said she'd come back." Something cinched tight in Alexander's chest. When did the ambulance take her? Rosie lifted her gaze to the big clock hanging on the station wall, her eyes trying to read the numbers. I don't remember exactly. It was still light out. My mom was holding my hand, and then she clutched her chest, and then she fell. Her voice began to shake. A lot of people ran over. Someone made a phone call. Then a vehicle came, with red and blue lights flashing. They put Mom on a bed with wheels. Mom held my hand and she said, "Rosie, wait here. Ask someone to help if you need it. I'll come back." Alexander looked out through the glass. Outside it was fully dark now, and the snow was still falling. If the girl was telling the truth, she'd been sitting here alone all day, from morning until night, waiting for someone who might never return. "You've been waiting here ever since?" he asked, his voice rougher than usual. Rosie nodded. "Mom said to wait, so I waited. I went to the bathroom once, but I ran really fast and came right back. I was scared Mom would come back and not find me." She paused, her eyes shining with tears, but she didn't let a single one fall. "But Mom didn't come back." Alexander said nothing. He didn't know what to say. In his world, everything could be handled with money, with power, with threats, but in front of him sat a 6-year-old child who had spent an entire day alone. Not crying, not screaming, only waiting in silence and apologizing for asking anyone for help. "What's your mother's name?" he asked. "Claire. Claire Bennett." Alexander nodded, took out his phone, and dialed. After a single ring, Roman answered. "Boss? Find every hospital in the city," Alexander said, his voice turning cold and decisive again, the same tone he used when giving orders. "Look for a patient named Claire Bennett, admitted on an emergency basis today. Let me know the moment you have an answer." "Yes, boss." Alexander hung up and looked back at Rosie. She was staring at him with wide eyes, not understanding what was happening, but a small, fragile spark of hope flickered there. "I'm going to find your mother," he said. Rosie blinked, as if she couldn't believe what she'd just heard. "Really?" "Really. But I don't have money to pay you." The girl lowered her head, her voice shrinking. "Mom says you shouldn't owe anyone." "Mom says..." "You don't need to pay me." Alexander cut in, his voice steady, but with something softer hidden beneath it. "I'm helping because I want to help." Rosie looked up at him with an expression he'd never seen anyone direct at him before. Not fear, not greed, not calculation, only the pure astonishment of a child who was being helped for the first time, without anyone demanding anything in return. "Thank you," she said, her voice trembling. "Thank you so much." Alexander didn't answer. He only nodded, then looked toward the station doors, where Roman was walking in with his phone pressed to his ear, his face serious. Alexander knew he was stepping into a world utterly unfamiliar to him, a world with no gunfire, no schemes, no enemies, only a 6-year-old girl with a pink backpack, and a mother lying somewhere in a hospital, unaware whether her daughter was safe. Roman needed time to contact the hospitals, and Alexander realized the little girl in front of him hadn't eaten anything all day. He stood, motioned for Rosie to follow, and led her to a small cafe right inside the station. The smell of toasted bread and warm coffee filled the space, but Rosie only stood there, both arms still wrapped tightly around the pink backpack, her eyes fixed on the floor as if she didn't dare look up at the food arranged behind the glass case. Alexander ordered a chicken sandwich, a cup of hot chocolate, and a few cookies. When the employee set the tray on the table, he slid it toward Rosie. "Eat." Rosie looked at the food, then at him, her green eyes flickering with hesitation. I can really eat? I bought it for you." The girl nodded and gently picked up the sandwich. She didn't devour it the way Alexander had seen other hungry children do. Instead, she ate slowly, taking small bites, chewing carefully, as if she were trying to make the meal last as long as possible. She took a sip of hot chocolate, her eyes closing for a brief moment as warmth spread through her chilled body. But when she'd eaten about half the sandwich, Rosie stopped. She carefully wrapped the rest in a napkin and tucked it into her backpack. Alexander frowned. "Why aren't you finishing it?" Rosie looked up, her clear gaze holding nothing back. "I'm saving it for my mom. Mom forgets to eat a lot. She says she isn't hungry, but I know she gives it to me." That simple sentence struck Alexander in the chest harder than any punch he'd ever taken. He stared at the child across from him, 6 years old, hungry all day, and still thinking about saving food for her mother. "Your mom gives you her food a lot?" he asked, his voice lower. Rosie nodded, her fingers rubbing the napkin. Mom cooks noodles for me, but she only eats the broth. She says she likes the broth better, but I know she's lying. She paused, her voice growing smaller. I'm not mad at her. I know she loves me. Alexander didn't speak. He just sat there, listening, and felt his world beginning to turn upside down. He lived in a sprawling mansion, ate lavish meals, spent money like water without ever having to think. And somewhere out there was a mother giving up bite after bite for her child, and a 6-year-old who had learned to share before she could even read. What does your mother do for work? He asked. She works at a grocery store during the day, then cleans offices at night, Rosie answered, her tone matter of fact, as if it were the most ordinary thing in the world. Mom comes home really late, but she always kisses me before I fall asleep. I pretend I'm asleep so Mom won't worry. Alexander felt his throat tighten, a 6-year-old pretending to be asleep so her mother wouldn't worry. A 6-year-old going hungry to save food for her mother. A 6-year-old apologizing for asking anyone for help. The phone in his coat pocket vibrated. He checked the screen. A message from Roman. Found her. St. Mary's Hospital. Patient Claire Bennett. Cardiovascular emergency. In the ICU. Alexander stood and looked down at Rosie, who was carefully slipping a cookie into her backpack too, surely saving that for her mother. Come on, he said. I know where your mom is now. The black Maybach glided smoothly through the streets of Chicago, streetlights flickering and reflecting off the thin layer of snow that dusted the sidewalks. Rosie sat in the back seat beside Alexander, her eyes fixed on the window as the city slipped past. She looked smaller than ever inside the spacious cabin, surrounded by cream-colored leather and luxurious gold-trimmed details. The pink backpack was still clutched tight in her lap, as if she were afraid that if she let go, everything would vanish. Does your mom get pain like today often? Alexander asked, breaking the silence. Rosie turned to him and nodded slightly. Mom holds her chest a lot, especially when she gets home from work. She thinks I don't see it, but I see everything. She paused, her fingers rubbing the backpack strap. One time I asked if it hurt, and Mom smiled and said she was just tired. She said grown-ups get tired a lot. It's okay. Alexander studied the child, the tightness in his chest growing sharper. Does your mom see a doctor? Rosie shook her head, her brown curls bouncing. Mom says doctors are really expensive. She says that money should be used to buy books so I can do better in school. Her voice grew softer. I told her I don't need new books, but Mom doesn't listen. She says I have to study hard, so when I grow up I won't suffer like she does. Alexander fell silent. He thought of the books in his own library. Thousands of them he'd never once touched, bought only because they were expensive and looked impressive. And somewhere out there was a sick mother who refused to see a doctor so she could save money for her child's books. Your mom's raising you by herself? He asked. Yes, sir. I don't have a dad, Rosie answered, her voice calm, as if it were the most ordinary thing in the world. Mom says Dad left and didn't come back. But it's okay. I have Mom, and that's enough. Alexander turned his gaze to the window. In his world, family was a web of complicated ties, full of calculation and betrayal. His father had been murdered by the very person closest to him. His mother had died in grief and loneliness. He'd grown up believing love was weakness, that trusting someone meant handing them the knife to stab you with. But the little girl beside him spoke of her mother with shining eyes, of sacrifice with gratitude, of love as if it were something that simply existed. My mom is the best person in the whole world, Rosie went on, her voice warmer when she spoke of her mother. Mom works all day, but every night Mom tells me a story before I go to sleep. Mom says no matter how tired she is, she'll never miss kissing me goodnight. Alexander didn't answer. He only watched her and realized he was stepping into a world completely unfamiliar to him. A world with no gunfire, no schemes, no betrayal. A world where a sick mother still forced herself to tell bedtime stories every night. Where a 6-year-old went hungry to save food for her mother. Where love was measured in quiet sacrifices instead of money or power. The car stopped at the gates of St. Mary's Hospital. White light spilled out from the building, reflecting off the snow and forming a soft glow. Rosie stared through the window, her green eyes brightening. My mom is in there? Yes, Alexander said as he opened the door. Come on, I'll take you in to see your mom. Rosie held her backpack tight and climbed out on trembling legs, shaking with anticipation. And Alexander, the most powerful man in Chicago, followed the 6-year-old into the hospital, not knowing his life was about to change forever. St. Mary's Hospital at night carried an unusual kind of quiet. The long corridors were lined with white carpet. Fluorescent lights shone in an even, steady wash, and the faint scent of antiseptic drifted through the air. Rosie walked beside Alexander, her worn canvas shoes making small sounds on the glossy tile floor. She gripped the straps of her backpack, her heart pounding inside her tiny chest. Alexander had spoken with the receptionist and been directed to the third floor, the intensive care unit. People recognized him, or at least they recognized the name Stone and the wealth that radiated from his expensive suit. No one asked any more questions. When he requested to see Claire Bennett after visiting hours, they stopped in front of a room with a glass door. Inside there was only a hospital bed crowded with wires and machines. Alexander looked in and saw a woman lying there, so thin and pale it was frightening. Her long brown hair spilled across the white pillow. Her eyes were tightly shut, and an oxygen mask covered most of her face. But no matter how weak she was, Alexander could still see that she was beautiful. A fragile beauty like a flower petal on the verge of wilting. Rosie stood beside him, her green eyes wide as she saw her mother. The little girl didn't cry. She only stood there, both hands clenched around her backpack, her lips pressed tight as if she were holding something back. "Mom," Rosie whispered, her voice so small it was almost impossible to hear. A nurse opened the door and let them in. Alexander followed Rosie inside, then stopped near the doorway to give mother and daughter space. The soft patter of small footsteps on the floor seemed to wake the woman on the bed. Her eyes slowly opened, the same shade of green as her daughter's, but dulled by exhaustion and medication. She blinked a few times, trying to focus, and when she saw Rosie standing by the bed, her eyes brightened as if someone had just lit a candle in the dark. "Rosie," Claire whispered through the oxygen mask, her voice weak and raspy. You're here." Rosie didn't speak. She climbed onto the chair beside the bed, set her backpack down, and took her mother's thin hand. The small hand clasped the adult one tightly, as if she were afraid that if she let go, her mother would disappear. "Are you okay?" Claire asked, tears beginning to slide down her cheeks. "I was so worried. I didn't know where you were. I tried to tell them about you, but I couldn't." I'm okay, Mom," Rosie said, her voice trembling, trying to steady herself. "I waited like you told me. I waited at the station." Claire cried harder, the tears soaking into the white pillow. "You waited all day?" "I'm sorry. I'm so sorry, sweetheart. I didn't want to leave you alone. It's okay, Mom." Rosie cut in, her small hand gently stroking her mother's hand the way adults often soothe children. "I'm fine. Someone helped me." Claire blinked and, for the first time, noticed the man standing near the door. Her green eyes turned to Alexander with caution, the instinct of a mother who wanted to protect her child. "Who are you?" she asked, her voice weak but still trying to hold on to a trace of firmness. Before Alexander could answer, Rosie spoke up. "This is Mr. Stone, Mom. He helped me find you. He bought food for me. He brought me here." Claire looked from her daughter to the unfamiliar man, her wariness slowly giving way to astonishment. You helped my child?" Alexander nodded, not knowing what to say. He wasn't used to moments like this, wasn't used to the sincere gratitude in someone's eyes. "Thank you," Claire said, her voice thick with emotion. "I don't know what to say. Thank you. Thank you for not leaving my child alone." Alexander wanted to say he almost had. He wanted to say he'd refused the girl coldly at first, but he didn't. He only stood there, listening, watching mother and daughter cling to each other and cry. "Mom," Rosie suddenly whispered, her voice small as if she were afraid of being scolded. "I'm sorry." Claire looked startled and smoothed her daughter's hair. "What are you sorry for, sweetheart?" "I bothered someone," Rosie said, her head bowed. "You told me not to bother anyone, but I asked him to help me. I'm sorry." Claire closed her eyes, tears still falling. She pulled her daughter into her arms, holding her tight even though her body was so weak she barely seemed to have the strength. "No, my love," she whispered. "You didn't do anything wrong. You did the right thing. You asked for help when you needed it, and that was the right thing to do. I'm proud of you. I'm so proud of you." Alexander stood in the doorway, watching it all, and felt something inside his chest beginning to melt. A 6-year-old apologizing for asking someone for help, a child taught that needing anyone meant inconveniencing them, and that sick, exhausted mother was crying. Not from pain, but because her daughter had learned to apologize simply for daring to reach out. He didn't understand this world. He didn't understand why a mother would teach her child that. But as he looked into Claire's eyes, he understood. She taught her daughter that because she had been turned away too many times. She taught her not to bother anyone, because she knew how cruel the world could be to people without money and power. And in that moment, Alexander Stone, the coldest mafia boss in Chicago, decided that this mother and child would never have to apologize to anyone again. Rosie had fallen asleep in the chair beside her mother's bed, her head resting against the bed frame, her small hand still wrapped tightly around Claire's as if she feared that if she let go, her mother would vanish again. The pink backpack sat near her feet, and inside it was still half a sandwich and several cookies the little girl had saved for her mother. Alexander sat in a chair in the corner of the room, watching the two of them in the dim hospital light. Claire watched her daughter sleep for a long time, then slowly turned to the unfamiliar man. She had removed the oxygen mask to speak, her breathing still heavy but steadier than before. "Who are you, really?" she asked, her voice raspy, but still edged with caution. "You're not an ordinary man. I saw the way the hospital staff looked at you. They're afraid of you." Alexander didn't answer right away. He looked at the woman in front of him, thin and fragile on the hospital bed, but with green eyes that were still sharp and wary. She was trying to protect her daughter, even though her body barely had the strength to protect itself. "I'm the man who met your daughter at the station," he said at last, his voice low and even. "You don't need to know anything more." Claire held his gaze for a long moment, as if trying to read something in that cold face. "You're wealthy. You're powerful. You can come into this hospital after visiting hours, and no one dares say a word. Men like you don't help strangers without a reason." Alexander's mouth lifted slightly, not quite a smile, more an acknowledgement. This woman was sharper than her weak appearance suggested. "You're right," he said. "Men like me don't help anyone without a reason. But today I didn't have one. I just couldn't walk away." Claire went quiet, as if weighing whether to believe him. Then she sighed and lowered her eyes to her sleeping daughter. "I owe you an explanation," she said softly, "about why she was alone like that." "You don't owe me anything. I want to tell you," Claire cut in, her voice firmer. "I've had a heart condition since I was a child. The doctor said I needed surgery years ago, but I didn't have the money. Insurance doesn't cover all of it, and She stopped, her breathing growing heavier. "I'm raising Rosie alone. Her father left when I was pregnant. I work 2 jobs, sometimes 3, just to make enough for rent and to keep her in school." Alexander listened without interrupting, without commenting. "I know my heart is getting weaker," Claire continued, her voice trembling slightly. "I know one day it won't be able to take it anymore. But I can't stop. If I take time off work, we won't have anything to eat. If I go to the hospital, who will watch her?" Tears began to slide down her cheeks. "Today I was walking Rosie through the station to go home after picking her up from school. Then my chest started hurting, worse than it ever has. I collapsed. I only had time to tell her to wait there, to ask someone for help if she needed it. I thought some adult would notice her. I thought she couldn't go on." The tears came faster, and she turned her face away, not wanting a stranger to see her cry. Alexander stayed still. He didn't comfort her, didn't offer empty words. He simply waited until she calmed. "I taught her not to bother other people," Claire said after a long while, her voice thick with emotion, "because I know how cruel this world can be. I've asked for help so many times, and so many times I've been turned away. I didn't want her to feel that. I didn't want her to get hurt." She looked down at Rosie, her weak hand smoothing her daughter's hair. "But I was wrong. I taught her to apologize for daring to need someone. I taught her that asking for help is something to feel guilty about." Alexander looked at them, and for the first time in many years he felt something other than coldness in his chest. "What did the doctors say about your condition?" he asked. Claire shook her head. "I haven't dared to ask. I'm afraid of the answer." Alexander stood and walked toward the door. "Get some rest. I'll speak to the doctor." "You don't have to do that." Alexander paused and looked back at her. "I know, but I want to." Then he stepped out of the room, leaving mother and daughter in the dim light, not knowing that his conversation with the doctor was about to change everything. Dr. William Chen was a middle-aged man with salt and pepper hair and the tired eyes of someone who had witnessed far too much life and death. He sat in a small office at the end of the hallway, a towering stack of medical charts in front of him. And when Alexander walked in, the doctor looked up with undisguised surprise. "Mr. Stone." "Doctor," Chen said, rising to shake his hand. "I didn't expect you here at this hour. Is there something I can help you with?" Alexander took the chair across from him and went straight to the point. Patient Claire Bennett, room 37. I want to know her condition. Dr. Chen hesitated. What is your relationship to the patient? I'm the one who's going to pay her hospital bill. The answer was simple, and yet it carried enough authority that Dr. Chen didn't ask another question. He opened Claire's file, flipped through a few pages, then let out a long breath. Miss Bennett's condition is very serious, he began, professional but unable to hide his concern. She's had dilated cardiomyopathy for a long time, but she has never received proper treatment. Today, she went into acute heart failure. We've stabilized her, but without surgery soon, her heart won't hold up. What surgery? Valve replacement and repair of some damage. It's a complex operation, but if it succeeds, she could live a normal life. Dr. Chen paused, looking at Alexander with grave seriousness. The problem is the cost. The surgery runs about $150,000, not including post-operative care and medication. Her insurance won't cover enough, and according to her records, she already owes the hospital nearly $30,000 from previous admissions. Alexander's expression didn't change. $150,000. To him, it was the kind of money he could spend in a single night without thinking. But to Claire, it was a fortune she could never reach. Pay it all, he said, his voice as even as if he were ordering an ordinary purchase. The old bill, the surgery, the medication, a private room, whatever she needs. I'll cover everything. Dr. Chen blinked, unable to hide his astonishment. Mr. Stone, that's a very large amount of money. I know. Alexander stood, pulled a black card from his wallet, and placed it on the desk. Schedule the surgery as soon as possible. If you need a better surgeon, bring them in. Money isn't the issue. He left the doctor's office and returned to Claire's room. Rosie was still asleep, but Claire was awake now, her green eyes watching him with anxious worry as he stepped inside. You spoke with the doctor? She asked, her voice trembling slightly. What did they say? Alexander sat down in the worn chair and met her gaze. You need surgery. $150,000. I've already paid. Claire went still. She stared at him as if he'd said the most insane thing she'd ever heard. What did you say? She whispered, not trusting her own ears. I paid your hospital bills. All of them. The old debt and the surgery. Claire shook her head, her eyes filling with tears. No, you can't do that. I can't accept it. That's too much money. I could never pay you back. I can't. I don't need you to pay me back. Alexander cut in, his voice calm, but carrying something else beneath it. But why? Claire asked, tears beginning to fall. Why are you doing this? You don't know me. You don't owe me anything. Why? Alexander was silent for a long time. He looked over at Rosie, sleeping deeply, the little girl with the pink backpack and the worn canvas shoes, the little girl who had apologized to him simply for daring to ask for help. Because of your daughter, he said at last, his voice lower than before. Because she apologized to me when she asked me for help. Because she looked at me without a trace of resentment when I refused her. Because she went hungry all day and still saved food for you. He paused, his breath heavier. A 6-year-old shouldn't have to apologize for needing someone, and a mother like you shouldn't have to die because she doesn't have money, Claire cried. Not from pain or fear, but because for the first time in many years, someone had seen her, truly seen her, and the quiet sacrifices she'd been making. Thank you, she whispered through her tears. Thank you. I don't know what else to say except thank you. Alexander didn't answer. He only nodded, then turned his gaze to the window, where the city lights blinked in the dark night. He didn't know what he was doing. He only knew that for the first time in many years, he felt like he was doing the right thing. 3 days later, Claire was moved to the pre-surgery unit. Dr. Chen instructed her to rest completely, not to worry or feel stressed. And that meant Rosie couldn't stay at the hospital with her mother day and night anymore. Claire panicked about where to leave her child. She had no relatives, no close friends, and the little money she'd managed to save wasn't enough to hire anyone to watch Rosie. But before she could even put her fear into words, Alexander offered a solution. The girl will stay at my house, he said, his voice calm, as if it were the most obvious thing in the world. Until you recover. Claire wanted to object, but she had no other choice. And strangely enough, she trusted this man. She didn't know who he was, didn't know what he did, but she trusted he wouldn't harm her daughter. That afternoon, The black Maybach carried Rosie away from the hospital. The little girl sat still in the back seat, the pink backpack pressed tight against her chest, her green eyes watching the view through the window with worry. She'd promised her mother she'd be good, that she wouldn't bother anyone, that she'd wait until her mother got well again. But inside the heart of a 6-year-old, fear still hovered like a dark cloud that refused to drift away. When the car stopped in front of the gates of the Stone estate, Rosie's mouth fell open. She had never seen a house so large. The tall iron gates swung wide, revealing a stone-paved drive that led to a massive mansion built in a classic style. Snow lay bright and thick on the roof and on the neatly trimmed shrubs, turning the scene into something out of a fairy tale. "Is this your house?" Rosie asked, her voice tiny. Alexander nodded, opened the car door, and led her inside. The interior startled Rosie even more. The main foyer was enormous, with a soaring ceiling, a sparkling crystal chandelier, and large paintings hanging on the walls. The marble floor was so polished she could see her own reflection in it. She walked on tiptoe, afraid her old canvas shoes might dirty something so beautiful. A middle-aged woman came out from deeper inside, gray hair pinned neatly at the nape of her neck, her face stern but her eyes warm. She wore a simple black outfit, carrying the composed air of someone who had managed this house for many years. "This is Maggie," Alexander introduced. "She'll take care of you when I'm busy." Maggie looked at the tiny girl with the pink backpack, and her gaze softened. She knelt to Rosie's eye level and smiled. "Hello, sweetheart," she said warmly. "What's your name?" "My name is Rosie," the girl answered, bowing her head politely. "I'm sorry for bothering you." Maggie blinked, startled by the apology. She glanced at Alexander, but he only gave a small shake of his head, signaling he would explain later. "You're not bothering anyone," Maggie said gently. "You're an honored guest. Come on, I'll take you up to your room." Rosie followed Maggie up the staircase, her eyes constantly drifting over the surroundings. The room meant for her was on the second floor, several times larger than the small apartment where she lived with her mother. A big bed was made with crisp white sheets. The curtains were deep red velvet, and in one corner a bookshelf was filled with bright, colorful storybooks. "This is your room," Maggie said. Rosie stood in the doorway, not daring to step inside. I sleep here? Yes, but it's too big." She looked down at her worn shoes, then at the spotless white rug on the floor. "I'm sorry. My shoes are dirty. I'll take them off." She hurriedly removed her shoes, set them neatly outside the door, and only then slipped into the room on thin socks that were frayed and torn. Maggie watched the child, then looked at the old shoes outside the doorway, and felt her heart tighten. She'd worked for the Stone family for decades, had seen all kinds of people come in and out of this house, but she had never seen a child like Rosie. A child who apologized because her shoes were dirty. A child so afraid of troubling anyone that she didn't dare step into a room meant for her. She turned and looked at Alexander standing in the hallway, and in the eyes of that cold man, she saw something she hadn't seen in 15 years. Concern. During the first days at the Stone mansion, Rosie lived like a small ghost. She moved so quietly she barely made a sound, ate in careful, measured bites, and always cleaned up perfectly after every meal. She never asked for anything, and she said she was sorry each time someone asked whether she needed something. Maggie tried to befriend her, cooking good meals, buying new clothes and toys, but Rosie only thanked her politely and then put everything in a corner of the room, afraid to use any of it in case she ruined it. She spent most of her time sitting in her room, hugging the pink backpack and staring out the window, waiting for news about her mother. Alexander kept going to work as usual, but he came home earlier than he used to. He didn't know why he was doing it. He only knew that whenever he sat in a boardroom or faced enemies in the dark, he found himself thinking about the tiny girl at home, alone inside that enormous mansion. Every night he stopped by Rosie's room to check on her, and she was always there, on the bed, with the workbook Maggie had bought for her. One evening, when Alexander pushed open Rosie's door, he saw her bent over the notebook, her brows drawn tight, her lips pressed together in fierce concentration. The pencil in her hand had been chewed down almost to nothing, and on the page were messy numbers that had been erased and rewritten again and again. "What are you doing?" he asked as he stepped in. Rosie startled and looked up, quickly covering the notebook, as if she were doing something wrong. I'm doing my math," she said. "I'm sorry. Am I being too loud?" "No." Alexander moved closer and looked down at the page. It was simple addition and subtraction for a first grader, but clearly she was struggling. "You don't know how to do it?" Rosie lowered her head, her cheeks flushing with embarrassment. I'm not good at math. Mom usually teaches me, but Mom's really busy, so she doesn't have much time. I'm sorry. Alexander looked at the girl, then back at the problem. 12 plus 8. So simple he could answer it in his sleep. But to Rosie, it seemed like a mountain she couldn't climb. He pulled a chair over and sat down beside her, something he hadn't done for anyone in years. Let me see. Rosie stared at him in surprise, as if she couldn't believe a man this powerful would sit down to help her with homework. She timidly slid the notebook toward him. Alexander studied the problem, then looked at her. You have 12 pieces of candy. Someone gives you 8 more. How many do you have altogether? Rosie thought for a moment, her green eyes lifting to the ceiling as if she were counting in her head. 20? That's right. Alexander nodded. Now write the answer here. Rosie carefully wrote 20 in the blank space, her handwriting crooked but clear. She looked up at Alexander, her eyes bright. I did it right? You did. A smile bloomed on her face, her first smile since she'd arrived. And in that moment, Alexander felt something strange in his chest, a warmth he had forgotten long ago. Can you teach me the next one? Rosie asked, her voice small but hopeful. Then she hurried to add, if you're busy, it's okay. I'm sorry. I shouldn't bother you. You're not bothering me, Alexander said, and he surprised himself by realizing he meant it. Turn the page. They sat together for more than an hour, going through one problem after another. Alexander explained with simple examples, turning dry numbers into candy, into apples, into things Rosie could picture. And she learned with startling speed, her eyes lighting up each time she understood a new calculation. Maggie stood in the doorway, watching in silence. She had taken care of Alexander since he was a 17-year-old boy shattered by his father's death. She had watched him grow up inside hatred and coldness. She had seen him build an empire with blood and tears. She had believed his heart had turned to stone for good, that nothing could soften him again. But now she was watching him sit beside a 6-year-old girl, patiently teaching her math, and on that hard face was something she hadn't seen in nearly 20 years. A smile. Small, only the faintest curve at the corner of his mouth. But it was a smile. A real smile. Not the polished one worn at society parties. Not the icy one he used when facing enemies. It was the smile of a man who, for the first time in a long time, felt peace. Maggie quietly stepped away, not wanting to break the moment. She didn't know what kind of magic that tiny girl with the pink backpack carried, but she knew something was changing in this house. When the homework was finished, Rosie looked at Alexander differently. Not with fear or hesitation anymore, but with trust, delicate as the first wings of a butterfly just beginning to open. Thank you, she said, her voice sincere. You're really good. Alexander didn't know how to respond. He was used to being praised for power, for wealth, for the fear he inspired. But being praised by a 6-year-old for helping her with homework was something entirely new. Good night, he said as he stood. Tomorrow I'll take you to see your mom. Rosie nodded, the smile still on her lips. And as Alexander walked out of the room, he realized he was looking forward to tomorrow, not because of meetings or schemes, but because he would get to see that smile again. That night, after leaving Rosie's room, Alexander didn't go to his own room right away. He walked down the dark hallway, his steps carrying him without thinking to the room at the far end of the 2nd floor, the room he had kept locked tight for nearly 20 years. He stopped in front of the oak door, his hand resting on the cold doorknob, and memory surged over him like a flood he couldn't hold back. 19 years ago, this room was where his mother had breathed her last. Alexander closed his eyes, and he was 17 again. He was kneeling beside the bed, gripping his mother's thin hand, watching the woman who had given him life fade away in the weak glow of candlelight. His father had been killed a year earlier, betrayed by the person closest to him, and shot dead right in front of Alexander's eyes. His mother, Victoria Stone, had tried to endure, tried to protect the family and raise him, but she couldn't. Her heart had shattered the day her husband fell, and her body had become an empty shell waiting to be released. Alex, she whispered, her voice as faint as a passing breath of wind. Come closer, my son. 17-year-old Alexander bent down, tears sliding over his cheeks even though he tried to hold them back. I'm here, Mom. I'm not going anywhere. Victoria smiled, her trembling hand reaching up to touch her son's face. You'll have to lead the family. I know you're not ready, but you don't have a choice. This world is cruel, and you'll have to be crueler than it is to survive. I can do it, Mom, he said, his voice breaking. I'll avenge Dad. I'll make them pay. Victoria shook her head slightly, sorrow in her eyes. Hate won't bring your father back. It will only turn you into a monster. She paused, her breathing growing heavier. Alex, promise me one thing. I promise anything you want. Power isn't meant to crush the weak, Victoria said, each word measured with care. Real power is protecting those who can't protect themselves. You'll have to do ruthless things, I know. But never harm innocent women and children. Never become the kind of monster you despise. Promise me, Alex. I promise, Mom. The boy tightened his grip on her hand, tears spilling freely now. I promise. Victoria smiled one last time, then closed her eyes, and the room sank into silence, broken only by the sobs of a 17-year-old boy who had just lost the last person in the world who loved him. Alexander opened his eyes and returned to the present. He stood there in the dark, breathing hard, his heart aching as if an old wound had been torn open again. 19 years. He had kept his promise to his mother for 19 years. He had built an empire, avenged his father, become the most powerful man in Chicago. He had done ruthless things, killed men who deserved it, made an entire city tremble at the name Stone, but he had never harmed innocent women and children, not once. He turned and walked back toward Rosie's room. The little girl was sleeping deeply. Her brown curls spread over the white pillow, her lips slightly parted, her breathing even and peaceful. The pink backpack sat beside the bed, within reach, as if she feared that if it were any farther away, it might disappear. Alexander stood in the doorway and watched her sleep, thinking of the promise he'd made to his mother. Protect those who can't protect themselves. Rosie couldn't protect herself. Claire couldn't protect herself. The two of them had been fighting this world alone for years, with no help, no shelter. And when this tiny child had needed someone, she'd had to apologize just for daring to ask. Alexander stepped inside, gently pulled the blanket up over Rosie, and tucked it around her. The girl shifted, her lips moving as she called for her mother in sleep, then sank back into peace. I'll protect you, he whispered, his voice so soft it was almost inaudible. I promise. And in the darkness, for the first time in 19 years, Alexander Stone felt he was truly living the vow he had sworn to his mother on that hospital bed long ago. The day of the surgery arrived on a gray winter morning. Alexander brought Rosie to the hospital early, when the sun hadn't fully risen yet, and the first snowflakes began to fall softly from the overcast sky. She sat in silence the whole way, the pink backpack held tight in her lap, her green eyes fixed on the window with a worry no 6-year-old should ever have to carry. Alexander didn't speak either. He only sat beside her, his presence the only reassurance he knew how to give her in that moment. When they reached Claire's room, she was awake, and the nurses were already preparing her for surgery. She looked paler than usual, but her eyes still brightened when she saw her daughter come in. Rosie ran to the bedside, climbed onto the familiar chair, and gripped her mother's hand. Mom, she whispered, her voice trembling. You're having surgery today, aren't you? Claire nodded and forced a comforting smile. Yes, sweetheart. The doctor is going to fix my heart so I can get better. Will it hurt? I'll be asleep, so I won't feel it. Claire smoothed her daughter's hair, tears beginning to well, even as she tried to hold them back. Rosie, listen to me. I need you to promise me something. Rosie nodded hard, her own eyes reddening. I promise. I promise anything you want. While I'm in surgery, you have to be good and listen to Mr. Alexander. Don't worry, don't cry. I'll come back to you. Claire squeezed her daughter's hand, her voice breaking. And remember this. No matter what happens, I love you more than anything. You're the best thing that ever happened to me. Rosie couldn't hold it in anymore. She buried her face against her mother's shoulder and cried. You have to come back. Promise me. Promise me you will. Claire wrapped her arms around her, tears sliding down her cheeks. I promise. I'll try my very best. I won't leave you alone. Alexander stood in the doorway, watching in silence. He had seen many farewells in his life. He had witnessed deaths and final words. But he had never felt pain like this, watching a sick mother force a smile so her child wouldn't be afraid. 15 minutes later, the nurses came to take Claire to the operating room. Rosie followed her mother all the way to the doors of the surgical wing, where she had to stop because she wasn't allowed to go any farther. Claire lay on the gurney and turned her head to look at her daughter one last time. I love you, Rosie. I love you, Mom. Rosie waved, trying to smile even as tears kept falling. Come back, okay? The operating room doors closed, and Rosie stood there, small and alone in the bright white hospital hallway. Alexander stepped up beside her and placed his hand on her trembling shoulder. "Come on," he said. "We'll wait in the family lounge." They sat in the waiting room for 6 hours. 6 hours that stretched like a lifetime. Alexander didn't work, didn't take calls, didn't leave even for a minute. He stayed beside Rosie, sometimes silent, sometimes talking so she wouldn't drown in fear. Rosie tried to be brave the way she'd promised her mother, but every time the operating room doors opened, she lifted her head with hope, only to lower it again when she realized it wasn't her mother's doctor. By the 4th hour, Rosie began to collapse from exhaustion. She fell asleep, her head resting against Alexander's arm, her small hand still gripping the pink backpack. He sat perfectly still, afraid to move and wake her, and he watched her innocent sleeping face, the long lashes still damp with tears. When Dr. Chen stepped out of the operating room, Alexander gently woke Rosie. Both of them stood and stared at the man in green surgical scrubs with shaking anticipation. The surgery was successful. "Doctor," Chen said, and Rosie let out a shaky breath of relief, her eyes lighting up. But Alexander noticed the doctor's expression wasn't entirely joyful. "Is there a problem?" he asked, his voice dropping. "Doctor," Chen looked at Rosie, then at Alexander, as if weighing whether he should speak in front of the child. Alexander understood and turned to Rosie. "Sit here and wait for me a minute, okay? I need to talk to the doctor." Rosie nodded and sat back down obediently, her eyes still fixed on the recovery room doors, hoping she'd see her mother soon. Alexander and Dr. Chen walked farther away, to a quiet corner of the hallway. "Tell me the truth," Alexander ordered, his voice cold but threaded with worry. "Doctor," Chen exhaled, the fatigue of a long surgery written across his face. "The operation went well. We replaced the valve and repaired what we could. But," he paused, choosing his words carefully, "her heart has been damaged for too many years. She never received proper treatment, never rested, never took her medication consistently. That damage can't be fully reversed." "What does that mean?" Alexander asked, tension sharpening his voice. "It means this surgery will extend her life, but it can't completely cure her. Her heart is still weak, and it will continue to weaken over time." Dr. Chen looked at Alexander with deep regret. "I can't tell you exactly how long. It could be a few years. It could be less. It depends on how well she takes care of herself, and on luck." Alexander stood rigid, feeling as if someone had driven a fist into his chest. He looked toward Rosie waiting on the chair, her green eyes full of hope, unaware that her world could collapse at any time. "Does she know yet?" he asked. "Not yet. I'll tell her when she's fully awake." Alexander nodded, then turned and walked back to Rosie. He didn't know what to say to the child. He only knew that no matter what happened, he wouldn't let her face it alone. 2 weeks after the surgery, Claire was moved from the intensive care unit to a regular room. She was still weak, still confined to the bed with tubes and monitoring equipment, but her eyes were brighter now, and a hint of color had returned to her cheeks. Every day, Alexander brought Rosie to visit her mother, and it was the part of the day the little girl waited for the most. Rosie would climb onto the chair beside the bed, take her mother's hand, and talk non-stop about everything happening in her life. "Mom, Mr. Alexander's house is so big," Rosie said excitedly, her green eyes sparkling. "My room has a bed way bigger than my old one, and there's even a bookshelf full of comic books. Mrs. Maggie cooks really good food, Mom. She makes pancakes for me every morning, and she gives me extra strawberry jam. I saved some for you, but Mr. Alexander said pancakes have to be eaten hot to taste good, so I ate it all." She paused, looking a little worried. "Was I too greedy, Mom?" Claire smiled, her weak hand smoothing her daughter's hair. "No, sweetheart. You can eat as much as you want. I'm happy you're eating well. And there's more, Mom," Rosie continued, unable to hide her excitement. "Mr. Alexander helps me with my homework every night. He explains it so well. I understand everything. He says I'm smart." She grinned, dimples showing. "Mom, he never tells me to apologize. One time I spilled water on the table, and I was so scared, but he just grabbed a cloth and wiped it up and said it was okay. He's so nice, Mom." Claire listened to her daughter's stories and realized something had changed. Rosie was smiling, talking, excited about life in a way Claire had never seen before. Her child, the little girl who always shrank into herself, who apologized for everything, who was always afraid of bothering people, was now speaking with a bright, open joy like any happy child. and it made Claire's heart feel both warm and sharp with pain. Warm, because her daughter was being cared for. Painful, because she realized that for so many years she had been unable to give her even the simplest things. That afternoon, while Rosie slept soundly on the sofa in the hospital room, Claire watched Alexander standing by the window, his tall frame silhouetted against the gray winter sky of Chicago. "Mr. Stone," she called softly. Alexander turned and walked back to the bed. "What do you need?" Claire studied him for a long time, as if trying to read something in that cold face. "I've asked you many times, and you've never answered me directly. Who are you, really? What do you do for a living that you can pay for everything like this without thinking? What kind of man are you?" Alexander was silent, his gray blue eyes fixed on the woman in the hospital bed. She was stronger now, but he knew the truth the doctor had spoken. Her heart was still weak, and there wasn't much time. Maybe she deserved to know the truth, at least part of it. "I'm Alexander Stone," he said, his voice low and even. "I run the Stone family. We do many things, some legal, some not." Claire didn't look surprised or frightened. She only watched him, her green eyes calm. "You're Mafia." It wasn't a question. It was a statement. Alexander nodded and didn't deny it. "Does Rosie know?" Claire asked. "No. She only knows I'm the man who helped you and her." Claire glanced at her daughter sleeping, then turned back to Alexander. Her eyes held no judgment and no fear, only honest curiosity. "Why would a man like you help us? We have nothing you could take. We have no value to you." Alexander didn't answer right away. He looked at Rosie sleeping, her brown curls spread on the pillow, her lips slightly parted, her face peaceful. Then he looked back at Claire. "Because your daughter looked at me the way no one ever has," he said, his voice softer than before. "Not with fear, not with greed, not with calculation. She just needed help, and she apologized for it. I've met every kind of person in my life, but no one has ever made me turn back after I'd already walked away. Your little girl did." Claire closed her eyes, tears sliding down her cheeks. Not from sadness, but because for the first time in many years, she didn't feel alone anymore. Claire opened her eyes, wiped the tears from her cheeks, and then looked straight at Alexander with a gaze that didn't waver. Rosie was still sleeping deeply on the sofa, her breathing steady and peaceful, unaware that the man caring for her was one of the most dangerous people in this city. Claire knew she should be afraid, should be worried, should be searching for a way to pull her daughter out from under this man's reach. But she couldn't, because that very man had saved her life, had cared for her child, had given them things she could never have provided on her own. "You've killed people," Claire said, not as a question, but as an acknowledgement of a reality she'd suspected for a long time. Alexander didn't deny it. "I've done many things people would call crimes. I'm not sorry for that." Claire nodded slowly, as if absorbing the truth. She didn't scream, didn't panic, didn't demand that he leave. She only watched him, her deep green eyes as if trying to see through the cold outer shell. "Are you a good man?" she asked, as gently as if she were asking about the weather. That simple question left Alexander silent. He'd been asked many things in his life, questions about money, about power, about life and death, but no one had ever asked whether he was a good man, because in his world, no one cared. "I don't know," he said at last, his voice lower than usual. "I've done ruthless things. I've caused a lot of people pain. I don't deserve to be called good." He paused and looked toward Rosie sleeping. "But I have one rule I've never broken. I don't harm innocent women and children. That was a promise I made to my mother, and I'll keep it until the day I die." Claire listened, and she understood this was the truth. This man wasn't trying to paint himself in softer colors, wasn't trying to justify what he'd done. He was simply telling it plain, bare, without cover. "Rosie trusts you," Claire said after a long silence. "She doesn't trust easily. Life has taught her that adults can't be trusted, but she trusts you." "I know, and I trust you too," Claire said with a faint smile, weary but sincere. "Maybe I'm crazy to trust a mafia boss, but you've done more for us than anyone else in this world. You don't have to be good to everyone. You just have to be good to my daughter." Alexander looked at the woman in front of him, a single mother who had fought life for years, who had sacrificed everything for her child, and who now lay in a hospital bed with a weakened heart. She wasn't afraid of him, wasn't judging him, wasn't demanding he change. She only asked him to treat Rosie well, and that was enough. "I'll protect her," he said, the words falling like an oath. "No matter what happens." Claire nodded, tears rising again. "Thank you." That's all I needed to hear. Outside the window, snow began to fall, blanketing the city of Chicago in a fresh, pure white. And inside the small hospital room, two people from completely different worlds found an understanding that needed no more words. 1 month after the surgery, Claire was discharged and brought to the Stone Mansion to continue her recovery. Alexander had arranged a spacious room for her on the ground floor, fully outfitted with medical equipment, with a private nurse on duty 24 hours a day. Rosie was beside herself with joy at being able to live with her mother every day. She ran back and forth between her own room and her mother's, chattering about everything and helping with small tasks whenever she could. In the first days, Claire truly seemed stronger. She could sit up, she could smile at her daughter, she could eat a little, but that joy didn't last. By the 3rd week, Claire began to tire more easily. She slept more, ate less, and sometimes she struggled to breathe even when she was lying perfectly still. The nurse reported to Alexander that her numbers were worsening, that her heart wasn't responding to medication the way they'd hoped. Alexander immediately called Dr. Chen and demanded a full evaluation, indifferent to cost or time. The test results arrived on a bleak afternoon. Dr. Chen sat in Alexander's office with a thick stack of files in his hands, his face heavy, as if he were carrying a death sentence. "Mr. Stone, I'm very sorry to have to tell you this," Dr. Chen began, his voice grave. "Miss Bennett's heart is failing faster than we predicted. The heart muscle tissue has been damaged too severely over the years, and the surgery could only slow the process. It can't reverse it." Alexander sat perfectly still, his gray-blue eyes locked on the doctor without blinking. "What about another surgery?" "A transplant? I'll pay whatever it takes." Dr. Chen shook his head, regret plain on his face. "A transplant is an option, but the waiting list is very long, and Miss Bennett's current condition isn't stable enough to endure a major operation like that. Her body is too weak." He paused, choosing his words carefully. "Mr. Stone, I've been a doctor for more than 30 years. I know when medicine can save someone, and when it can't. Her heart has already made its decision. All we can do now is keep her as comfortable as possible for the time she has left." "How long?" Alexander asked, his voice squeezed tight. Dr. Chen exhaled. "I can't say exactly. It could be a few weeks, it could be a few months, but not long." After Dr. Chen left, Alexander sat alone in his office, silent. Outside the window, snow continued to fall, whitening the vast gardens of the estate. He stared out at it, but he wasn't truly seeing anything. His mind felt hollow, as if someone had emptied every thought out of his head. For the first time in his life, Alexander Stone felt completely powerless. He had built an empire with his own hands. He had crushed the strongest enemies. He had made an entire city tremble at the sound of his name. He had money, power, and an army of men ready to do anything he ordered. But all of it was useless against the illness that was taking Claire's life day by day. He couldn't threaten death. He couldn't bribe sickness. He couldn't command her weakened heart to beat harder. He thought of Rosie, the little girl in the room with her mother, unaware that her world was about to collapse. She had only just started smiling again. She had only just learned how to trust. She had only just begun to taste the happiness of having her mother beside her every day. And now it would all be stolen away. Again. Alexander stood and walked to the window, pressing his hand to the cold glass. He had watched his own mother die when he was 17. He knew what that loss felt like, knew how it could ruin a person, and he didn't want Rosie to suffer through that. But there was no way to stop it. All he could do was stand there, powerless, watching the snow fall, and wait for the inevitable. 1 week after the conversation with Dr. Chen, Claire asked Alexander to come to her room late one night. Rosie was asleep in her own room, the pink backpack placed beside the bed as always, and the mansion had sunk into silence. Alexander stepped into Claire's room and immediately saw that she had grown much weaker in only a handful of days. Her skin was so pale it looked almost translucent, her lips dry and colorless, yet her green eyes were still bright, still alert, as if she were forcing every remaining ounce of strength into staying upright. "Mr. Stone," Claire called, her voice weak but clear. "Sit down. I need to talk to you." Alexander pulled a chair to the bedside, as he had so many times in the past weeks. He didn't speak. He only waited, because he knew Claire would talk when she was ready. Claire looked at him for a long time, as if gathering courage. Then she drew a deep breath, even though it made pain flare in her chest. "I know I don't have much time," she began, her calmness almost unnatural. I can feel it. My body is giving up, day by day. I'm not afraid to die, Mr. Stone. I've been ready for a long time. The only thing I'm afraid of is Rosie. Alexander stayed silent, his chest tightening. She has no one else but me, Claire continued, tears starting to rise even as she fought to hold them back. Her father left when I was pregnant. Her grandparents are gone. I don't have brothers or sisters, no relatives. If I'm gone, Rosie will end up in foster care. Her voice caught. Do you know what foster care is like? I do. I grew up in it. I know how children get treated, how they get abandoned, how they get hurt. Rosie won't survive that. She's too sensitive, too easily wounded. What do you want me to do? Alexander asked, even though he already knew. Claire met his eyes, her green gaze full of tears but not weak. I want to ask you for one thing. I know it's too much. I know I have no right to ask anything of you. But I'm begging you, as a mother about to lose everything, as someone who has nothing left to lose except her daughter. She paused, breathing hard. Please adopt Rosie. Please give her a family. Alexander sat still, saying nothing for a long time. He thought of his life, of the dark empire he had built, of enemies waiting in the shadows, of dangers that never stopped circling. A child shouldn't grow up in that world, but a child shouldn't grow up in foster care either, alone and unwanted. I'm not a good man to raise a child, he said, his voice low and slow. I know, Claire replied, not arguing, but you're the only person I trust. You've given us more than anyone else ever has. You made her smile again. You taught her her homework. You sat beside her when she was scared. Rosie trusts you, and I trust you'll protect her. Alexander looked at the woman in front of him, a mother pleading for the one thing that mattered most in her life, and he couldn't say no. All right, he said, the words falling like a vow. I'll adopt Rosie, legally, officially. She'll carry the name Stone. Claire broke down, sobbing without control. She reached for Alexander's hand, her thin fingers shaking but gripping hard, as if clinging to her last hope. Thank you, she whispered through tears. Thank you. I don't know how to repay you. You don't owe me anything. Claire shook her head, tears still falling. There's one more thing, more important than everything. She looked at him, urgent. Rosie apologizes all the time. You've seen it. She apologizes for everything, apologizes for existing, apologizes for needing someone. That's my fault. I taught her wrong. I wanted to protect her from rejection. So I taught her not to bother anyone. But I was wrong. I taught her to feel ashamed for needing anyone. Alexander listened without interrupting. Please teach her the opposite, Claire said, her voice breaking but determined. Teach her there's nothing wrong with asking for help. That needing people isn't weakness. That she doesn't have to apologize for existing. Her grip tightened. Teach her she deserves to be loved, deserves to be cared for, deserves to be happy. Please. That's the last thing I want to ask you. Alexander looked at the dying mother, a woman using her remaining breath to worry about her child, and something fractured inside his chest. He had witnessed many deaths. He had watched men beg him for their lives. But no one had ever asked him for something like this. No one had ever asked him to teach a child how to love herself. I promise, he said, his voice rough. I'll teach her all of it, every day, until she believes it. Claire smiled, a smile soaked in tears, and yet filled with peace. She eased back into the pillow, her eyes closing, her breathing softening. Thank you, Alexander, she whispered, saying his first name for the first time instead of his last. Rosie will be okay. I believe that. Alexander sat beside the bed, holding the hand of the woman drifting into sleep, and he knew the promise he had just sworn would change his life forever. 2 days after that conversation, Claire weakened with a frightening speed. She could barely open her eyes. Her breathing grew heavy and labored, and the nurse had to stay at her side day and night. Rosie noticed the change. She grew quieter, often sitting beside her mother's bed and holding her hand for hours at a time, as if she were afraid that if she let go, her mother would disappear. Alexander was there too. He didn't go to work, didn't see visitors, didn't care about anything beyond the mother and child in this small room. On a late January night, with snow falling thick outside and wind whistling through the window panes, Claire suddenly opened her eyes. Her green eyes shone in a strange way, clear and awake, as if some unseen force had poured strength back into her. She turned her head toward the nurse, sitting by the bed. Call Alexander and Rosie in here, she said, her voice weak but unmistakably clear. "Call both of them." The nurse nodded and hurried out. Only minutes later, Alexander stepped into the room, holding Rosie's hand as she rubbed her eyes, having been woken in the middle of the night. She was still in the pink pajamas Maggie had bought, her brown curls messy with sleep. But the moment she saw her mother's eyes open, and her mother smiling, she was instantly wide awake. "Mom!" Rosie ran to the bed, climbed onto the familiar chair, and grabbed her mother's hand. "You're awake. You're better now, aren't you, Mom?" Claire didn't answer that question. She only looked at her daughter with love in her eyes, her thin hand trembling as it brushed Rosie's hair. "Rosie, my love," she whispered, "come closer. I want to see you clearly." She didn't understand why her mother was speaking that way, didn't understand why her voice sounded so choked with feeling. She only knew her mother was looking at her as if it were the last time, and it made Rosie's heart clamp tight with pain. "Mom," Rosie said, her voice shaking, "you're going to get better, right? The doctor already did surgery. You'll be okay." Claire smiled, a sad smile filled with love. "Rosie, listen to me. I have to go somewhere very far away." Rosie shook her head hard, tears beginning to spill. "No, you can't go. You promised. You promised you wouldn't leave me." "I know," Claire whispered, tears sliding down her cheeks as well. "I'm sorry. I want to stay with you. To watch you grow up, to see you go to school, to see you graduate, to see you become whoever you want to be. But my body won't let me anymore. My heart is so tired. My love," Rosie cried, tears dropping onto her mother's hand. "I'm sorry, Mom. I'm sorry I wasn't good. I'm sorry I made you worry. I'm sorry for—" "No." Claire cut her off, her voice suddenly stronger even as her body faded. "Rosie, look at me." She waited until her daughter lifted her face, green eyes full of tears meeting her mother's tearful gaze. "You have nothing to be sorry for. Do you hear me? Nothing at all. You didn't do anything wrong. You have never done anything wrong. You are the best, bravest, most wonderful child I have ever known." "But Mom—" "I'm not finished," Claire went on, gathering every last ounce of strength into her words. "I taught you one thing wrong, and I need to fix it before I go. I taught you not to bother people, taught you to apologize when you needed help. I was wrong. There's nothing wrong with asking for help, my love. There's nothing shameful about needing people. You deserve to be loved. You deserve to be cared for. You deserve to be helped. Promise me. Promise me you won't apologize for needing someone anymore." Rosie sobbed and nodded again and again. "I promise. I promise, Mom." Claire smiled, her weak hand touching her daughter's cheek. "You're the best thing that ever happened in my life, Rosie. From the moment I knew I was going to have you, I knew my life meant something. Everything I did, every sacrifice, every bit of pain, it was all worth it because I had you. You are the greatest gift life ever gave me. I love you," Rosie whispered through her sobs. "I love you so much. And I love you too, more than anything in this world." Claire's gaze shifted to Alexander, standing beside the bed, his eyes red even as he tried to hold it back. "Mr. Alexander will take care of you from now on. He's a good man. You can trust him. And remember this, even if I'm not with you, I still love you. Forever." Claire pulled Rosie into her arms, holding her daughter close one last time. She felt the warmth of that small body, felt tears soaking into her gown, felt the little heartbeat thudding fast against her. She wanted to keep this moment forever, wanted time to stop, wanted one more day, one more hour, one more minute, holding her child. But she knew she didn't have much left. "I'm tired," Claire whispered, her voice growing weaker and weaker. "I need to sleep." Rosie lifted her head, frightened. "You'll wake up, won't you? Promise me." Claire didn't answer. She only smiled, the most peaceful smile she had ever worn, and then she closed her eyes. Her breathing slowed, softened, like a candle going out in the quiet night. Alexander stepped closer to the bed and laid his hand on Rosie's shoulder. The little girl didn't cry out loud anymore. She only sat there, gripping her mother's hand, staring at the calm face drifting into an endless sleep. And in that warm room, in the middle of a bitter winter night, Claire Bennett drew her last breath in the arms of her daughter and the man who had promised to protect her for the rest of his life. The funeral was held on a bitter winter day, with the Chicago sky so gray it felt as if the city itself were in mourning. Alexander had arranged everything, from the white oak casket to Claire's favorite white roses, to her final resting place in a quiet cemetery overlooking Lake Michigan. There weren't many people there, only Maggie, Roman, Dr. Chen, a few nurses who had cared for Claire, and of course Alexander and Rosie. It was a small, simple service, and yet it was filled with dignity and love. Rosie stood beside Alexander throughout the ceremony, her small hand gripping his. She wore the black dress Maggie had bought, her brown curls brushed neatly, and her green eyes fixed on her mother's casket as it was lowered into the earth. She didn't cry. Not a single tear fell down her cheeks the entire time. She only stood there, silent, her face blank as if her soul had gone down into that cold ground with her mother. Alexander watched her, his chest tightening with pain. He knew this silence was more frightening than sobbing. He knew the grief was being held inside that small body, waiting for the day it would burst. But he didn't know what to do. All he could do was stand beside her, hold her hand tightly, and hope that would be enough. When the service ended, Rosie walked up to her mother's grave. She laid a white rose on the fresh mound of earth, then knelt, her small hand touching the cold headstone. "Goodbye, Mom," she whispered, her voice so small the wind almost carried it away. "I love you." Then she stood, turned her back, and walked away without looking back. On the drive back to the mansion, Rosie sat motionless in the car, her head resting against the window, watching the world pass without really seeing any of it. Alexander sat beside her, not knowing what to say, able only to share the silence with her. Sometimes, silence is the only thing we can give one another. When the car stopped at the gates of the estate, Rosie didn't get out right away. She sat there, her eyes still on the window, and then she suddenly spoke. "Mr. Alexander." "Yes, Rosie." She turned to look at him, her green eyes dry but filled with fear. It was the look of a child who had lost everything, standing at the edge of despair, terrified that the only person left would disappear too. "You won't leave me too, will you?" she asked, her voice trembling as if she feared the answer. Alexander looked at her, and he remembered the promise he'd made to Claire, remembered the promise he'd made to his mother long ago, remembered the night he'd stood in Rosie's doorway and sworn he would protect her. He leaned down to her level and took both of her trembling hands in his. "Never," he said, his voice firm as an oath. "I'll never leave you. This is your home now. I'm your family now, and family never abandons each other." Rosie stared at him, as if searching for any sign of a lie in those gray-blue eyes, but she found none. She only saw sincerity, determination, and something that felt like the kind of love she thought she'd lost forever. She nodded, said nothing more, then opened the car door and stepped out. Alexander followed behind, and as they walked into the vast mansion, he realized the house didn't feel as cold as it used to. Now there was someone inside it who would be waiting for him to come home. The days after the funeral were the hardest days Alexander had ever lived through, not because of business or enemies, but because he had to watch a 6-year-old girl slowly break apart piece by piece, and he didn't know how to put her back together. Rosie didn't cry. She didn't talk about her mother. She didn't mention anything connected to Claire. She grew terrifyingly quiet, like a small shadow drifting through the mansion's vast rooms without leaving a trace. Every night, Alexander heard Rosie crying in her sleep. She had nightmares, calling for her mother without knowing it, then waking in the middle of the night with panicked eyes and fast, shallow breaths. Each time he heard her, he got up, went to sit beside her bed until she fell asleep again. But he didn't know what to say to soothe the pain inside that small heart. He was used to solving problems with power and money, but there was no power and no money that could bring her mother back. Rosie also began to refuse food. She sat in front of meals Maggie had prepared with such care, lifting food with her fork and setting it back down again without bringing it to her mouth. When asked, she only shook her head and said she wasn't hungry. Maggie, worried, told Alexander, and he tried to make Rosie eat, but she only managed a few small bites before pushing the plate away. He watched her grow thinner by the day, the sweet dimples in her cheeks sinking deeper and deeper, and he felt more helpless than he ever had. Then one morning, everything broke open. Rosie was helping Maggie clear the breakfast table, something she did on her own even though no one asked her to. She carried each cup, each plate, carefully, walking slowly to the sink. But when she lifted the last glass tumbler, her hand suddenly shook, and the glass slipped from her fingers, hit the floor, and shattered into hundreds of tiny pieces. The crash rang through the quiet room, and Rosie froze. Alexander had been sitting at the table reading the newspaper when he heard it. He looked up, and what he saw tightened his chest. Rosie stood there among the broken shards, her whole body trembling, her face paper white. Her green eyes were wide with fear, as if she'd committed the most unforgivable crime in the world. "I'm sorry," she whispered, shaking so hard she could barely speak. "I'm sorry. I didn't mean to. I'm sorry. Please don't send me away. I'll be good. I promise I'll be good. I'm sorry. I'm sorry." She repeated the apologies like a broken machine. Tears began to spill, and her body curled inward as if she were bracing for punishment. Alexander stood and moved quickly toward her, careful to avoid the glass on the floor. "Rosie," he said, making his voice as gentle as he could. "Look at me." But she didn't hear him. She kept apologizing. She kept trembling. She kept crying. All the grief she'd held inside for days suddenly poured out without control, tangled with the terror of being abandoned, of being sent away, of losing the only person she had left. Alexander didn't know what to say. He only knew what his heart told him to do. He dropped to one knee, lifted her up and away from the broken glass, and pulled her into his arms. He held her tight, as if he could shelter her from every pain in the world. Rosie went stiff for a second in his embrace, then collapsed against his chest and sobbed. Not the silent crying of the nights before, but deep, ragged sobs, as if the grief she'd been trying to hide had finally been set free. Alexander held her, one hand stroking her back, and spoke in the warmest voice he could find. "You never have to apologize for little mistakes, Rosie. It's just a glass. It doesn't matter. You matter." He paused, his breath heavier. "And I will never send you away. Never. Even if you break every glass in this house, I'll still be right here. Do you hear me?" Rosie didn't answer. She only cried into his arms, and Alexander held her there, in a kitchen scattered with broken glass, until her sobs slowly softened and she fell asleep from exhaustion. 3 months had passed since the night Rosie cried in Alexander's arms in a kitchen littered with shattered glass. 3 months wasn't long, but it was long enough for wounds to begin healing, little by little, like new shoots pushing up through a hard winter as they wait for spring. Rosie was still sad. She still missed her mother. But she wasn't living like a shadow anymore. She had started to laugh again. Rosie's laughter first rang through the stone mansion on a spring morning when Maggie accidentally spilled flour onto her own face while baking. Rosie had been standing nearby watching her cook, and when she saw Maggie's face turned white like a clown's, the laughter burst out of her before she could stop it. The sound was bright and clear in the kitchen, and Maggie froze, tears nearly spilling from happiness. It was the most beautiful sound that house had heard in nearly 20 years. Alexander enrolled Rosie in a private elementary school near the estate, a place where she could learn in the safest and most secure setting possible. On the first day, Rosie clung to his hand at the gate, her green eyes full of worry. She was afraid of a new school, new classmates, afraid of being separated from the only person who made her feel safe. But Alexander knelt down, looked her straight in the eye, and promised he'd pick her up at 3 o'clock sharp, not 1 minute late. And he kept his promise. Every day, at exactly 3 o'clock, the familiar black Maybach pulled up at the school gate, and Alexander Stone, the most powerful mafia boss in Chicago, stood there waiting to pick up a 6-year-old girl after class. Other parents watched him with curiosity and unease, not knowing who the cold man in the expensive suit was. But Alexander didn't care. He only cared about the moment Rosie ran out through the gate, her face lighting up when she saw him, and her clear voice calling out across the crowded schoolyard. Rosie also began to apologize less. She no longer apologized when she wanted a glass of water, no longer apologized when she needed help, no longer apologized for small mistakes. Whenever she started to say sorry out of habit, Alexander would gently remind her she didn't need to, and little by little the reflex began to fade. She was learning to accept that she deserved love without asking permission for it. But Rosie wasn't the only one changing in that mansion. Alexander was changing too, in ways even he didn't fully notice. He began coming home on time, turning down long evening meetings so he could make it back for dinner with Rosie. He began smiling more, not the cold smile or the polite social mask, but a real smile, the kind he had forgotten he ever had. He began talking more, telling Rosie stories about his own childhood, about his mother, about memories he had buried for years. Roman was the first to recognize the change. He had followed Alexander for 15 years, had watched him become cold and ruthless after his mother's death. But now Roman was seeing another Alexander, an Alexander who could laugh, who could care, who could love. And he knew that the tiny girl with the pink backpack had done what no one else had been able to do in nearly 20 years. "The boss has changed," Roman said to Maggie one evening as they stood in the hallway watching Alexander and Rosie play chess in the living room. I've never seen him like this. Maggie nodded, her eyes wet. That child saved him. He thinks he's saving her, but really, she's the one saving him. In the living room, Rosie's laughter rang out as she won a game. Alexander pretended to be annoyed, frowned, and demanded a rematch, but the corner of his mouth betrayed his smile. And Rosie, the little girl who once apologized for daring to exist, was now laughing loudly and proudly declaring she was smarter than Mr. Alexander. Outside the windows, spring had arrived. The snow had melted, and the first flowers were beginning to bloom in the garden. Life was moving forward, and in a mansion that had once been cold and lonely, there was laughter now, and love, and a family slowly taking shape from the broken pieces of fate. A year had passed since that fateful night. A year since a 6-year-old girl apologized for daring to ask a stranger for help at a train station. A year since Alexander Stone, the coldest mafia boss in Chicago, turned back to look for a child he had refused. A year of change, of wounds slowly closing, of a family forming where no one would have expected it. On a December afternoon, exactly 1 year after the day they met, Alexander and Rosie passed by Union Station. They hadn't planned to go there. They were only driving by on the way home after Alexander picked Rosie up from school and took her to buy books. The black Maybach glided along familiar streets, and when the station came into view, Rosie suddenly sat up straight, her green eyes locked on the tall building with its brightly lit windows. "Stop," she said abruptly. "Please stop." Alexander signaled the driver to pull over to the curb. He looked at Rosie with quiet confusion, but she was already opening the door and stepping out before he could ask. He followed her, and they stood there together at the entrance to Union Station, surrounded by the steady rush of people flowing past as always. Rosie stared at the station, her eyes distant, as if she were remembering something from a lifetime ago. She was a little taller now, her brown curls longer, her face no longer thin and pale like it had been the first day they met. She wore a warm red coat Maggie had bought, new boots on her feet, and the same old pink backpack still on her shoulders, even though it was frayed in a few places now. "Rosie?" Alexander called softly. "What is it?" Rosie didn't answer right away. She stepped closer to the gate, peering inside through the large glass panes. Inside, it was still crowded the way it had been that day. The announcement still echoing overhead, suitcases still rolling across the floor, hurried footsteps still cutting through the noise. But now, when Rosie looked in, she didn't feel afraid or alone anymore. "This is where I met Dad." The words came out lightly, naturally, as if it were the simplest fact in the world. But to Alexander, it struck like lightning in a clear sky. He went still, his heart skipping a beat, his ears refusing to believe what he'd just heard. Rosie turned to look at him, her green eyes clear and honest. "I was so scared that day," she went on, her voice gentle. "I sat alone all day, not knowing where Mom was, not knowing what to do. I asked you for help, and you walked away." She paused, then smiled. "But you came back." Alexander felt his throat tighten. He'd been called many names in his life. Boss, Mr. Stone, Alexander, and even the terrifying names enemies whispered about him. But no one had ever called him Dad. No one had ever looked at him with the trust and love the little girl in front of him was offering now. "You," he began, but Rosie cut him off. "I'm not your kid anymore," she said, small but steady. "I'm your daughter. You adopted me. You took care of me. You stayed with me when I cried. You helped me with my homework. You promised you'd never leave me." She stepped closer and took his hand. "Mom is gone, but I'm not alone anymore, because I have you." Alexander knelt until he was level with Rosie. He looked at her, this child who had changed his life, who had taught him how to love again, who had given him a reason to live beyond hate and power. His gray-blue eyes, once cold as ice, were wet now. "You're calling me Dad," he said, his voice rough. Rosie nodded, her smile bright. "Because you are my dad." Alexander pulled her into his arms, right there on the busy street, in front of the station where they'd met for the first time. He didn't care who was watching, didn't care about the hard image he'd built for years. He only knew that in this moment he was holding his daughter, and that was the only thing that mattered. "Thank you," he whispered against Rosie's ear. "Thank you for giving me a family." Rosie hugged him tight, her face pressed into his shoulder, and in that moment, amid the hurried crowd and the noise of the city, two lonely hearts finally found each other. 1 week after they returned to Union Station, Alexander took Rosie to visit her mother's grave. The cemetery was quiet in the winter morning, rows of bare trees standing still beneath a gray sky, and a light layer of snow lay over the graves like a fragile blanket. Rosie carried a bouquet of white roses and a small letter folded neatly in her coat pocket. Father and daughter stood in front of Claire's grave for a moment without speaking. Alexander stepped back one pace, giving Rosie her own space with her mother. Rosie knelt, placed the bouquet on the mound, then took out the letter and began to read it aloud, as if her mother were sitting there listening. My dearest Mom, I miss you so much. Every day I think about you. I miss the sound of you singing me to sleep. I miss the smell of bread you baked every morning. I miss the way you held me when I was scared. I know you're up in heaven, looking down at me, and I want you to know that I'm okay. I'm really okay now, Mom. Rosie paused, drew a deep breath, then continued. Mom, I don't say sorry so much anymore. Do you remember, before you went, you told me there's nothing wrong with asking for help, that I deserve to be loved. I've learned that now, Mom. Dad teaches me every day. Dad tells me I don't have to apologize for needing someone. I don't have to apologize for little mistakes. I don't have to apologize for existing. Dad says I'm a gift, not a burden. Tears began to roll down her cheeks, but she kept reading. Dad Alexander is so good to me, Mom. He picks me up from school every day, helps me with my homework every night, and tells me stories before I fall asleep. He never leaves me alone, the way you never left me alone. I have two people who love me the most in the world, one in heaven and one right beside me. I'm the luckiest child. Rosie folded the letter, slid it beneath the flowers, and stood. She turned to Alexander, her green eyes wet, but her smile bright. I'm done talking to Mom now, Dad. Alexander stepped closer and set his hand on her shoulder. Your mother would be so proud of you. Rosie nodded, then reached for his hand. Together they turned and walked away from the cemetery, hand in hand, their shadows stretching long across the white snow. Behind them, the wind moved softly, as if Claire were waving goodbye, knowing her daughter was loved and protected. The story of Rosie and Alexander is proof of something simple, but deeply true. Asking for help is never something to be ashamed of. Needing other people isn't weakness. Sometimes, the smallest apology can open a door to miracles we never expected. And sometimes, the moment we choose to turn back instead of walking away is the moment that changes an entire life. Thank you for listening to today's story. If you felt moved and you'd like to hear more meaningful stories like this, please subscribe to the channel, hit like, and share this video with the people you love. We'd really like to know how you feel about this story. Did it make you think of someone in your life? Did something in it touch your heart? Leave a comment below so we can hear what you have to share from the deepest place in you. Wishing all of you watching this video good health, a joyful life, peace, and happiness every day. Goodbye, and we'll see you again in the next video.